Hello and welcome to my presentation for the unit Challenges to American Hegemony. We're tackling the question, how successful was George Bush's War on Terror? The phrase war on has traditionally been used for a lot of things, and notably in the 80s, I believe, it was war on crime, there's war on drugs, war on poverty, war on disease. These things are all used from a political standpoint. And it was in his speech shortly after the 9/11 attacks. George Bush said that there was going to be a war on terror, and this is really something that then stuck through this time period. It's worth just visiting the time before 9/11. So the guy in the centre, as you probably know, is Osama bin Laden. And he instigated a number of attacks he believed was the great enemy. You can see on the left side was from one of the bombings, I believe it was the Kenya bombing, and then the other side is the attack on the USS Cole, which resulted in the death of some US Navy servicemen. If we go back to the question, so we need to define the question. Now, it's asking how successful was Bush's war on terror. So the question itself is the war on terror was a response to the 9/11 attacks. It notably is known as the attacks that start, or the wars that started in Afghanistan and then Iraq in 2003. But actually, these attacks, this war on terror was all over the world, right into the Far East and into Africa. So for the purposes of my question, to help narrow it down a bit, I will be considering Bush's war on terror from 2001 to 2008. So basically, from the 9/11 attacks to when George Bush left office in 2008 and handed over to Barack Obama in 2009. This is a really exciting period in history now. Now, the graph that you see on the screen is actually from a South African article analysing South African input into the Second World War. But I really think it helps to highlight potentially where we are at the moment. So if we go up with the arrows, you're looking at close to the war or the event, and as time goes further on, you get more resources available to the historian. And then after a period of time, you get the revisionist theories. So if we think about the Vietnam War, there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of historians writing on historians. And if we think about World War II, a vast amount of literature where it's been revisionist history and then re-revisionist history and then re-revisionist. But we're in the sort of stage now where we've had the official history. So the 9/11 Commission 2004, Chilcot Inquiry 2016, but originally it was announced in 2009. And then the Lord Justice Charles Haddon Cave Independent Inquiry of Afghanistan in the United Kingdom. The date of that is to be confirmed, but it's currently ongoing. We're almost at the stage now where the first round of revisionist history are now coming out, and we're perhaps looking at the war in a different context to what we may have done, for example, in 2010 or 2005, possibly earlier. So we're at the stage now where that fresh batch of literature is now being written. I think we perhaps sit somewhere between the after the war side and the after the post-war period, somewhere in the middle. So we've got the campaign histories, and as I said, we're now perhaps coming into the revisionist phase. So how do we define success in the war on terror? Well, you could go military, geopolitical, security or lack thereof, destroying terrorism completely, or perhaps the public image of the United States and the world. Now, if we think about the public image of the United States, the World Trade Center was a symbol of US power in the world order. So that was really attacked. So you could argue that main objective was to promote the public image in order to prevent further attacks down the line. going back to the text in the module, these are what I've drawn out as perhaps Bush's aims, covering the period 2008. We can't define a lack of a quick victory as a success, because he said he expected a lengthy campaign. Operation Enduring Freedom. The objective of this operation was to dismantle Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And if we look at the October to December 2001, this was largely successful at a cost of 12 military casualties. Now, to topple a regime of 12 casualties, arguably, actually, you could say the initial phase was indeed a success. It was very successful. But Osama bin Laden still escaped, and as the man behind the attacks, that was perhaps a failure. But if we look at the other wars, so the regimes and the democracy that was installed in Afghanistan and the Iraq regime, could the objective actually be to spread democracy and liberalism in the Middle East and across the world? How do we define that? Again, maybe that was a success because governments were put in. But actually, how strong were those governments? That is something that is still being determined. So if we look at the successes first. So the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda leadership in the early phase were largely killed or captured. So you could say actually the terrorists were destroyed in that instance. The Taliban was driven out of power, so a friendly government was installed. There was no mass casualties since 9/11. So actually, the objective of destroying terrorism in the United States is arguably very successful. But we must bear in mind there are other attacks elsewhere in the world, notably London and Madrid, not to mention the attacks in France in the 2010s. But in terms of failures, well, when George Bush left office in 2008, the war was still going on. So actually, for his period and his tendency, that needs to be seen as a failure. The financial cost, actually, the financial cost ran into the many trillions, and not to mention the human cost. Now, that's still going on, and as you can see in the picture, the cost by the individual is still being borne, and then it's only a matter of time before we then see those start to play out in the healthcare system and in society and people's lives. So on to Iraq now. If you look at the success, now he mentioned in one of his pre-Iraq war speeches that he wanted to counter the axis of evil. Now if we think about that, actually, if Iraq was perceived to be part of his axis, then yes, you could argue that actually the attack was successful. It could also be seen as a demonstration of power to the aggressive nations, or in the public eye, US public eye, of North Korea and Iran, acted as a warning. This is what could happen to you. And this was really backed up by the lightning campaign by the United States, demonstrating their military superiority, not only in numbers, but also in technology and weaponry. But there are also failures in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was directly born out of the Iraq War. So if the objective was to destroy terrorism, then actually, how can we argue that it was successful when another organisation which grew into ISIS was actually then arguably a greater danger to particularly the Middle East than there was before the war on terror started? And if you look at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, these two really affected the US reputation. So the view of the United States in the international community certainly took a moral hit. You can argue about the actual hit it took in terms of quantitatively, but certainly the image was tarnished. Now, if we go back into Iraq 2008, the surge took place. Now, this was an American-led initiative by General Petraeus that you could say led to a safer place. But we can't just establish George Bush's and the administration role in this, because you've got the Sons of Iraq program and the role of the Mahdi Army. These two, the program and the Mahdi Army, were both had quite an effect on the casualties. But in order to quantify Bush's success, we probably have to research how successful are these programs. And there is a bit of debate going on actually as to the success of these programs. And if we zoom right out, actually, if we look at the grand strategic picture, there's a lot of talk at the minute on grand strategy. The resurgent Russia and the rise of China, these two were allowed to, these two countries then operated without so much of a lens upon them. And it can be argued, or has been argued, that the United States, to use the phrase, took its eye off the ball. And then if we perhaps zoom in a little bit closer, but still on the war on terror, now we're looking at the global war on terror. And you can't really, in my opinion, argue about Bush's war on terror without talking about the global one. So as we said, yes, there's ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but ISIS and its affiliates spread to many of the provinces. Notably in 2021, when they were withdrawing from Afghanistan, the ISIS-K in Khorasan were known to be a threat. They also spread to Africa, whereas ISIS affected a lot of friendly governments in Africa. One example is the map in the top right corner of the diagrams from the French Operation Serval into Mali, which was to topple and combat Islamic terrorism in Central Africa. And if we look at the bottom right, this is just a quick graph I took out from War on the Rocks. Now, I've not really gone into this in detail, but it's an example actually how, in terms of quantitative data, you can actually argue that since the War on Terror was launched, the attacks have actually increased across the world. So thank you very much for watching my presentation. I'll be keen to discuss throughout the week areas where you thought the war on terror was successful. What areas would you attribute more success to the earlier aims and objectives, be they defeating Al Qaeda, the regime change in Iraq, or perhaps the wider war on terror. So thank you very much, and I'll speak to you throughout the course of the week.